This is our first project for the homemade rod wrapping jig made out of a cardboard box. You can see both ends of the rod support are adjustable. This is handy, especially if you're using epoxy finish, so you can level your rod out. If you level it out, it'll keep the epoxy from pulling up too much on one side. All I'm doing here is placing the line through the book in an area that I determined was giving me a good amount of tension for wrapping the thread onto the rod blank. And in this project, all I'm doing is wrapping on each side of multi-piece rods. I'm wrapping a color band. That way you can identify what section goes with which handle. And the reason I'm doing this is because we have 4 rods that are all colored exactly the same. They're the same model. They're different lengths. So this will be a handy way to identify them quickly, to reassemble them so they don't get mixed together. And then you have to go through and sort out the different sizes. All I did to start the wrap was place some masking tape on one end and started wrapping a spiral up the rod until I reached the point where I wanted my trim band. And then you just start wrapping back towards where you put the tape and wrap over the spiral, and that will lock it down. And you're going to want to put anywhere from 5 to 10 turns on that where you've wrapped over where you started from, just to make sure you've got it locked in place really well. What I'm doing here is just moving the threads a little bit, getting them closer together so there's not any gaps, and also trying to keep it symmetrical somewhat. And once you've reached a point where you've got enough wraps back over your spiral, you're going to want to pull your tape off, and you're going to cut the line as close as you can to your trim band. A lot of people like to use razor blades. I like these little cuticle scissors that I found. They're pretty small, and I've actually had to redo wraps when using a razor blade because I've nicked the trim band that I was doing, or the guide wrap, if you're putting on line guides on a rod blank. So once you trim that off, I'll go ahead and put in a loop here, and that loop is going to allow me to pull the thread back under itself. I put more turns on this part than most people do. Most people do 5, 7. I do at least 10 usually. And the reason I do that is because I like to trim the line pretty short. I pull it in tight, as you'll see here in a second. I like to pull the line in tight and then cut it off with just a little bit of a tag. And the more wraps you have, the more likely you are to be able to pull it through without it sticking out the other side. So all I'm doing here is I'm going to run the line through that loop, and then I'm going to pull it down tight until I get some tension on it. And once you've got it to where it's just about to go back under the threads, you're going to want to cut that and leave just a little bit of a tag to give it something to hold onto under the wraps. You see there's just a little bit of a tag there. Now I'm going to pull this back towards myself. And that's important because if you were to pull it away from you in the opposite direction of the way the line was tensioned, it will actually loosen that wrap, and that will cause you to have to redo your wrap because the threads will get loose and it won't lock down like it should. Then after I get that done, I go through and just try to make it as symmetrical as I can and make sure there's not any gaps in my line. And what I'm using here to finish these, since this is not really a critical wrap, is I'm using clear fingernail polish. And it works pretty well. I mean, I believe it's called a nitrocellulose lacquer, and I believe that's what they used to use a long time ago for wrapping rod guides and things on fishing rods. Epoxy is more durable. It's harder. This stuff is not that hard, but it'll work. And if you do a couple coats, it'll hold the line together to where it won't unravel or anything. It's easy to scratch, and the good thing about it is, though, you can go back and redo it real easily. Just put some more on it, and the scratch areas will kind of disappear as you add more to it. It kind of softens itself and rebonds itself as you reapply it. On this part here, I'm just wrapping the rod end that goes with the handle, and it's just the same process. You're just going to start with your tape and wrap your spiral and start wrapping back on top of the spiral that you started with to lock it down. This is the same process you'd use if you're wrapping a guide onto a rod blank also. The only difference is you'd start on the blank like I am here, and you'd wrap up onto your line guide, and then you'd put finish over all that. So this is kind of a good way to practice. And if you don't need to make color bands for your rods, if you're just wanting to practice, if you have an old rod or a broken one, or even a dowel rod, a wooden dowel rod, just anything to practice on, because it does take you a few times usually to get the hang of it, and once you get the hang of it, it's pretty easy. The hardest part is your finish, and the stuff I'm using, this clear fingernail polish, is real simple to use. The epoxy finish is a little different. It's a little trickier, but a little practice and you'll get the hang of it, and it won't be a big deal. But I would recommend at least starting on a broken rod or a dowel rod, something that you don't mind if you mess it up. It's not going to be an issue. Of course, any of this can be undone. If you decide you don't want these color trim bands later, it's not a problem to get it off, especially with the clear fingernail polish. You can put a little acetone on it just to soften it up and cut the line and unwrap it all pretty quickly. Not a big deal. The epoxy is a little harder. There's ways to do it. It's a little trickier though. You can see there I left a little bit of a tag there to pull back through, and I'm going to pull it towards myself again to keep tension on that line. And as many wraps as I put over that where I put the loop in, I don't ever really have tag ends sticking out. Some people will end up with a tag end and they'll cut it with a razor blade, and then they'll usually heat it with a lighter or something to melt the end of it to flatten it out a little bit. And I'd rather not do that. If you get too much heat on it, it will burn right through the wrap, and you'll have to do it again. It'll break it. To me, it's easier just to wrap more over your loop and leave just a short tag that will pull completely under the wrap. And I didn't mention this before. I edited this video. I put on a coat of the clear fingernail polish, and I cut the video. I let it dry before I put the second coat on. And you might be able to tell here that, I'll cut the video, and when it comes back, the rod's in a little different position. And you need to let it dry for a few minutes before you put another coat on. If you don't, you'll just smear it around and make a mess of it. But if you'll just put this on thin, it doesn't look bad at all. It's not as shiny as epoxy finish when it's dry, but it will give you a nice finished look, and it will provide some protection for the thread. It'll keep it from unraveling. It'll give it a little protection. And you can always go back, and if it does get scratched, you can go back and put a little bit more finish on it